So thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about critical race theory tonight. This is an important subject and a complex and an academic one. I'm going to do my best to introduce it, and I hope that the names and ideas that I'm laying out are really just the beginning of a conversation for our group. I hope that you follow any leads that interest you in this, and I'm going to share this presentation in the chat afterwards. You can just copy them out in text, and then maybe bring them back at a later time in your own conversation or your own presentation. Also, I want to say that, and I said this in the email too, that this is like kind of a highly debated subject. It's triggering. There's a lot of organizations and news about it, talking about it. And I just hope that you see what I'm presenting as hopefully one side of it or one aspect of it from where I have found it. I'm not an expert. I'm not an academic, so take it just coming from Soon and suspend kind of your disbelief or just sit with your uncomfortable feelings as they come up. And I want to hear what you have to think about it afterwards, for sure. So I'm going to start out with a quote from Kimberly Crenshaw, who is really one of the founding thinkers of what we know of as critical race theory. And this is a quote from an interview she gave last summer after a lot of the brutal killings of Black Americans by police kind of re-put racial justice in the forefront of our national conversation. And this is her quote. She says, critical race theory is a practice. It's a way of seeing how the fiction of race has been transformed into concrete racial inequities. It's an approach to grappling with the history of white supremacy that rejects the belief that what's in the past is in the past, and that the laws and systems that grow from the past are detached from it. There's a lot there. So she talks about the past. Let's kind of look at the history of CRT to start with. And I had to dig back. People think it's, how is it related to Marxism? Where did this come from? And this is just a really simplified little stepping stones of how critical theory and cultural studies were foundational to critical legal studies, and critical race theory emerged from that. And this is all happening in the 20th century up until the present day, pretty much. So it's pretty new. So what's critical theory? Our first stepping stone in the last document. It really emerged as a sociological theory, and it was developed in Germany and at the University of Frankfurt. And these people, these critical theorists, were taking inspiration from Marxist theory of the relationship between the base and the superstructure. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in detail in the next slide. But that theory focuses on how power and domination operate. So, and over on the right side of the screen, I talk about this a little bit. It is a social theory oriented toward critiquing and changing society as a whole. So think about the word critical, right? Diane said I was critiquing her. I wasn't really, but it's taking a look at something in a way that's not just accepting it, right? Like you can offer a positive critique, you can offer a negative critique, or you can just look at it and say, well, there's something more to be seen here. Thusly, we uncover assumptions, like it says in the next paragraph. So more about this base and superstructure. What is that? So here is, can you all see what that says up at the top? It says the structure of human society. It might be covered up by the Zoom screen, but this is an illustration of Karl Marx's base and superstructure concept. And Marx was a historian, an economist, a sociologist, a philosopher, and famously a socialist also. His theory consists of two parts, the base and the superstructure. he puts forth that the base comprises the forces and relation of production, everything that we need to produce the necessities of life. And the base determines society's other relationships, and that's what's up on top. It comprises its superstructure. This is our culture, our institutions, our political power, structures, roles, religion, government, art, everything. And while he says that the superstructure does affect the base sometimes, the influence from the base to the superstructure is the dominant role. And he's concerned with that. He's concerned that our base and our economic production, our capital, our wealth, maybe has a little too much power in shaping our culture. So from that, out of critical theory, in the early 20th century, come just a whole bunch of branches of cultural studies. It looks at everything. And a lot of them are coming out of social upheavals of the 1960s, post Jim Crow and civil rights, another wave of feminist movements, the American Indian movement, and cultural studies practitioners really start to focus on how particular phenomenons relate to matters of our own identity. And I'm not going to talk too much about that, but I'm going to say that one of those main cultural studies is legal theory, and critical legal studies emerges out of cultural studies and critical theory. And that's important to our conversation. So critical legal studies, what is that? It is, or critical law studies. So critical law studies is theorists are interested in how laws are used to maintain the status quo of society's power structure. And they're looking at our laws to find legalized forms of society's biases against marginalized groups. They're activist scholars. And these guys are informed by Marxism. They are informed by critical theory. And a lot of them are, politically leftists. A lot of them are white men mostly. And so their main claim is that laws are used to maintain the law, and that the law is a codified form of society's biases. And from critical legal studies emerges critical race theory. So you can kind of see how these things are happening in the academic world, but they're really kind of tracking along with our national pulse and like what's happening with law and policy. And so throughout the 70s and early 80s, this started to branch into legal studies. And the very first Black Harvard law professor who was tenured at Harvard, his name is Derek Bell. He's often thought of as the godfather of critical race theory. He's really looking at understanding why, after all this, quote unquote progress is made in the civil rights era, desegregation, anti-discriminatory laws in voting, why are there still so many inequities across races in the United States? And he developed something called the interest convergence theory. The interest convergence theory of his stipulates that Black people achieve civil rights victories only when white and Black interests converge. And his signature example is Brown versus the Board of Education, which happened only because it also advanced white interests too. So a key perspective of critical race theory is understanding that CRT theorists believe and put forth that race is a socially constructed idea, and that racial difference is invented. It's perpetuated and reinforced by society and laws. For critical race theorists, racism is understood to be complex, subtle, and flexible. It manifests differently in different contexts. And critical race theorists argue that the majority of racism remains hidden beneath normal life. It's only the most obvious and crude forms that we see, like the KKK burning crosses or something. Critical race theory also view whiteness as a social construct and a malleable identity. Whiteness is a racial discourse, whereas the category of white people represents a socially constructed identity, usually based on skin color. But whiteness in this sense refers to a set of assumptions, beliefs, and practices that place the interests and perspectives of white people at the center of what is considered normal and everyday. So it's important to remember that critical scholarship on whiteness is not an assault on white people themselves. It's an assault or a challenge to the socially constructed and constantly reinforced power of white identifications, norms, and interests. Simply, racism can be an everyday fact of life for people of color, even if white people like myself rarely notice it. So CRT gives us a few methods of deconstructing the power of racism. One of them is revisionist history. With many of you, we've already done this part of this year, reading Stamped from the Beginning. Revisionist history challenges a whitewashed and ahistorical record of America's past, and it tries to replace those perspectives with the lived experiences of minoritized populations. So an example is, learning about what happened in Tulsa 1920 massacre, or reading Stamped from the Beginning, or an Indigenous people's history of the United States that offer a non-dominant narrative of our nation's history. This can validate current lived experiences for people who've been minoritized, and it really helps support the desire for change. So another tool is counter storytelling. And counter storytelling is, the main point is uncentering, again, the dominant culture narrative in all of our history textbooks, film, academia, et cetera. And with that, centering or creating a space for community voices to create their own narrative and define their own experiences and lives. Examples of this can include firsthand accounts and personal stories. So the idea here is that, and maybe I should define dominant culture. Dominant culture refers to the practices, norms, and ideas that have the most power and influence in social, institutional, and economic structures. So even when an underprivileged community is at the center of the storytelling, the narrative tends to come from elite or privileged individuals outside the community. Something that pops into my head is the movie Pocahontas. While I love the music, I really don't think that Pocahontas just fell in love with John Smith and everybody was happy, right? So by giving power to the voices of individuals and communities, counter storytelling fights against the dominant culture narratives that lack the knowledge and wisdom that minoritized individuals hold about themselves and their traditions, cultures, communities, etc. So here is another sometimes buzzword that we talk about, sometimes Amery United, and I think is really connected to critical race theory. I'm kind of spinning off of critical race theory and on into some of the applied things that seem to be in our present moment a little bit more. So Kimberly Crenshaw again came up with this term, and intersectionality, it's used to explore how multiple forms of inequality and identity interrelate in different contexts and over time. For example, the intersecting roles of race, gender, class, and ability. And just to put that into context, you could think that men and women could experience racism differently, just as women of different races could experience sexism differently, and so on. So it's a concept that enables us to recognize the fact that perceived group membership can make people vulnerable to various forms of bias. Perceived group membership, okay? And yet, because we are simultaneously members of many groups, our own complex identities can shape the specific way we experience that bias. So I'm talking a little bit about an external identity, a perceived identity, and our own internalized identities of ourselves. And that's also another way to consider this. So I want to talk a little bit more about racial identity, as we kind of brought that up in the last slide, but racial identity in terms of colorblindness. So what is racial identity? It's an individual sense of having their identity defined by belonging to a particular race or ethnic group, right? And in terms of colorblindness, I'm just going to say that defining our identity is not easy. It's complex. And as a white person, my race was made and it's remade daily, practically invisible to me. I don't have to think about it unless I want to, unless I opt in, right? And that's a privilege too. So this invisibility is a privilege to me. This is colorblindness. And if I assert that that's the way that other people should live their lives, I am erasing them. This is what Sonia Renee Taylor's quote is really about. I recommend, I'm not going to read this whole quote, but I recommend checking it out and this book and just looking up Sonia Renee Taylor online. She has a ton of social media stuff, and she's a body acceptance activist and a racial justice activist, and she's just kind of a badass. So check her out. So colorblindness, I hope you could see that colorblindness upholds racism because it erases real lived experience and true history to the benefit of the dominant culture. Maybe I can, if you guys want me to come back to this slide when I'm done, and you can finish reading that quote. I know it's a really long quote. So anti-racism, we talk about this a lot. We have it in our mission statement. So what is it? It's a form of action against racial hatred, bias, systemic racism, and the oppression of marginalized groups. What I want to do is try to stitch together some of the things that we talk about day to day with critical race theory. And I think we can connect that the movement of anti-racism to CRT by looking at the approaches and trying to understand some of the anti-racists who we read, such as Ibram Kendi. He's written that there is no such thing as not racist. And that includes policies, right? They're either racist policies or anti-racist policies. So now we're starting to think about that critical legal studies a little bit, right? And tying into that. Kendi's scholarship of racism is firmly rooted in making the truth of the nation's policies visible. He concludes also that the law and dominant societal structures that we have constructed may be causing racial harm, and often to the benefit of the privileged. So here we're starting to even tie back all the way to the critical theory and that base and superstructure. So now you can start to connect these dots a little bit. And I think that I loved this quote from How to Be an Anti-Racist. It's in chapter 4. And I think it's really important because it kind of brings in to color blindness and how color blindness is used to erase talking about racism. I don't see color, or in a lot of ways, you know, the ideas of a meritocracy is challenged here too, because, you know, once we can see race, we can see racist policies, then you can't really say that everyone just has the equal abilities to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. A book I just am about halfway through is called The Racial Healing Handbook, and it's really hopeful. I kind of want to end on a hopeful note because it's really difficult to organize through hate or sadness or grief. I mean, those are natural things that are going to come up once we start looking at our racial identity. But this quote here is great. She says of racial liberation, "The journey is one that we must take together. It promises the possibility of moving through the pain and grief to experience the hope, resilience, and freedom that helps you not only self-actualize, but also makes the world a better place." And these are just some of my own thoughts I think, you know, as a group, I hope we can take some action to develop our positive racial identity. I'm speaking, you know, mostly to our white members right now, and I say that because I think that acting as an anti-racist evolves alongside the work of understanding our own racial identities. So we can't really be acting in anti-racism without that very key part. And increasing our cultural competency. Like, what does that even mean, right? It means being able to look and see a true history and understand like how our society really works. And it's a key step in developing race consciousness. And when we have this, we can heal from grief and trauma. And I think we can just be a lot more effective in building our, you know, creating community around racial healing. So that is my last slide. Besides all these sources, if anyone wants to read them, I will put a link to this